Imagine a child raised in the ruins of a besieged city, fighting for respect in a cramped communal apartment. Now picture that same child, decades later, standing atop the Kremlin, having reshaped Russia and challenged the entire world order. This isn't a fictional plot. This is the story of Vladimir Putin. From the harsh streets of Leningrad to the corridors of global power, his journey is a masterclass in transforming personal discipline into national strategy. How did a former KGB agent rise from the chaos of a collapsed superpower to become one of the most consequential and controversial leaders of our time? The answer lies in 8 brutal lessons forged in survival, mastered in the shadows, and executed on the world stage. Welcome. Today, we're deconstructing the making of a modern-day Tsar. We'll trace the origins of Vladimir Putin's unshakable worldview to a childhood of poverty and a youth dedicated to the disciplined art of Judo. We will follow his formative years in the KGB, where he learned the chessboard of geopolitics. We'll witness his return to a Russia in freefall and his ruthless, rapid ascent to absolute power. Finally, we'll analyze the legacy of the man who rebuilt a state with an iron fist, redrew the boundaries of international power, and left a question that will define the 21st century. What is the true cost of restoring a nation's pride? This is the Putin blueprint. Vladimir Putin was born in 1952 in a Leningrad still scarred by the horrors of its recent Nazi siege. His childhood in a poor, overcrowded communal apartment was not merely a humble beginning, but a formative crucible. In this microcosm, where multiple families shared a single kitchen and bathroom, Putin learned primal lessons in survival, the necessity of asserting oneself in a confined space, the value of silence and observation in a complex environment, and the paramount importance of strength to avoid being trampled. Poverty and harshness were daily realities, but in his mind, they were not a source of shame, but a challenge to be overcome. This environment fostered an early pragmatic form of nationalism. Leningrad was a symbol of Russia's resilience against invaders, and stories of its heroes were woven into the city's fabric. Here, he developed a profound sense that personal strength was not a luxury, but a prerequisite for dignity and respect. The discipline he acquired was not just physical, but psychological and emotional. He learned to suppress emotions, viewing them as vulnerabilities in the daily equation of conflict. His childhood was not filled with abstract dreams, but with a fierce desire to escape his circumstances and never return. It cemented a core conviction. The outside world was an extension of that communal apartment, but on a vaster, more ruthless scale. A world of competing resources governed by power and ironclad boundaries. This hard realism, absorbed from the streets, would later evolve into the geopolitical philosophy guiding his leadership, rooted in the belief that international law and diplomacy are mere reflections of the underlying balance of power. In the chaos of his upbringing, the sport of Judo provided Putin with an alternative, ordered universe. It was far more than a physical pursuit. It was a complete existential philosophy that later became a governing methodology. The gentle way, the meaning of Judo, was an apparent contradiction to his harsh childhood, but in essence a refinement of it, transforming raw strength into calculated force and random violence into precise maneuvers. From Judo, Putin learned fundamental lessons in leadership, self-control under pressure, tactical patience in waiting for the right moment, and respect for the opponent as a strategic necessity. These principles manifested clearly in his political style. The calm demeanor he became known for was not a natural disposition, but a trained skill from years on the mat, where showing anxiety or haste meant presenting a weakness. Crucially, Judo taught him the art of using an opponent's strength against them. In international politics, he applied this brilliantly, turning Western sanctions into a rallying cry for domestic unity, leveraging NATO expansion to justify Russian military strengthening, and using European dependence on gas as a tool of geopolitical pressure. In Judo theory, a stronger opponent isn't necessarily a threat, but can become a source of power if their momentum is redirected. The profound principle he derived was that discipline precedes power. Power without self-discipline is chaos. Strength without control is self-destruction. This understanding led him to build a system of rule based on strict control over circles of power, shaping the state into a coordinated body like that of a professional fighter, where every move is calculated and every reaction is measured. Putin's years in the KGB were more than a job. They were a fundamental transformation of his mental and psychological framework. The agency was not a normal institution, but a state within a state, possessing its own worldview and philosophy for understanding power in the shadows. Here, Putin evolved from an ambitious youth into a professional technician in the arts of managing hidden force. In the KGB, he mastered the art of reading between the lines, not just of documents, but of people, situations, and the hidden history behind visible events. This skill became foundational to his governing style, paying obsessive attention to minor details that reveal major truths, searching for hidden motives behind public statements, and understanding that surface appearances are often just the tip of the iceberg. Risk management was a precise science in the intelligence world. Putin learned that every decision is a calculated gamble, and the true art lies not in avoiding risk, but in choosing the right risks at the right time. This approach was evident in his bold policies. The invasion of Chechnya was a risk, but he chose it believing the risk of Russia's disintegration was greater. The intervention in Syria was a gamble, but he calculated the potential downsides were outweighed by the strategic benefits. Most importantly, he developed long-term strategic thinking. In the KGB, a good agent thought not only of the current mission, but of future missions in a sequence and of the broader picture of national interest. This pattern of thought defined Putin's rule. His decisions were not circumstantial reactions, but steps in a long-term trajectory to restore Russia's standing. Putin's return to Russia in 1991 was an existential shock. He left a disciplined superpower only to return to rampant chaos where every constant of his life was disintegrating. The Russia of the 1990s was not just a poor country, it was an entity with a dissolving identity, being looted by new elites, losing control of its borders, and transforming from a global system into a marginalized state. This spectacle of national collapse was, for Putin, both a personal and collective humiliation. The man molded by the school of a strong state saw how an empire could turn into a weak monstrosity. This experience defined the central motive of his political life, to prevent a repeat of the collapse. All his subsequent decisions can be understood through this lens. Extreme centralization was a reaction to chaos, political repression a reaction to lawlessness, and military expansion a reaction to weakness. What Putin understood early was that the Soviet collapse was not merely economic or political, but a psychological collapse of the nation. Russians accustomed to boasting of superpower status found themselves suddenly begging at the West's doorstep. This collective narcissistic wound became the fuel for his political project, to restore national dignity at any cost. The key point is that Putin returned not just to save Russia from poverty, but to save it from historical humiliation. This is what made his rhetoric resonate deeply not only with elites, but with ordinary citizens who felt insulted by their country's transformation from America's rival to a recipient of aid. Putin's rise to power was no accident, but the result of a precise interaction between his personal competence and the system's needs at a critical moment. When appointed prime minister in 1999, Russia was again on the brink. The war in Chechnya was escalating, the economy was faltering, and President Yeltsin was searching for a successor who would guarantee his protection and preserve the country's stability. What distinguished Putin at this moment was his icy calm amidst the storm. While Moscow's elite was in a state of panic, he appeared as a man unshaken by crises and alert to opportunities. This calm was not an absence of emotion, but a strategic control over it, a skill honed in Judo and refined in the KGB. Apparent competence was a major attractive factor. In the chaotic 1990s, when the elite was looting the state, Putin appeared as a disciplined man, not a heavy drinker, not overly talkative, and efficient in executing tasks. This image of the serious man in a time of absurdity was what exhausted Russia needed. But the real intelligence lay in his alliance with real power. Putin understood that power in post-Soviet Russia was concentrated in two hands: the new businessmen, the oligarchs, and the security services, the siloviki. He allied with the latter and offered the former a deal. You can keep your wealth if you cede political power to me. This seemingly simple deal was in fact a fundamental shift in the nature of the Russian system. The decisive moment was the Second Chechen War. Here, Putin transformed from an unknown bureaucrat into a symbol of national toughness. His harsh rhetoric against separatists and his promises to restore order touched a deep Russian need for a decisive leader. By 2000, he was not merely Yeltsin's successor, but the embodiment of the nation's desire to emerge from the tunnel. Putin's project of rebuilding the state was not merely an administrative reform, but a counter-revolution against the chaos of the 1990s. His vision was clear. Russia must be transformed from a loose confederation of private interests into a strong, centralized state, with Moscow as its sole center of gravity. The first phase was restoring the state's monopoly on violence. In the 1990s, gangs controlled the streets, oligarchs controlled the economy, and regional governors challenged Moscow. By the mid-2000s, Putin succeeded in reconcentrating power in the Kremlin. The oligarchs were tamed through submission or exile, regional governors were turned into executive employees, and the military and security services were rebuilt as reliable instruments of the state. The second phase was reconstructing the social contract between state and citizen. The offer was simple: relinquish some political freedoms, and I will guarantee you stability and prosperity. This contract worked well in the first decade of Putin's rule, as the economy achieved strong growth fueled by rising oil prices and Russia recovered some of its international prestige. But the core of the project was redefining Russian identity. After the Soviet collapse, Russia wavered between conflicting identities. Was it part of Europe, a Eurasian empire, a Russian nation-state? Putin provided an answer. Russia is a distinct civilization with its own values, its own interests, and its own destiny. This shift from a state to a civilization gave his project an existential dimension, turning any external criticism into not just a political difference, but an assault on Russian identity itself. The test of any true leader comes not in times of prosperity, but in moments of existential crisis. Putin's rule has been a continuous series of such tests, and his method of handling them reveals the essence of his leadership philosophy. The Second Chechen War, 1999 to 2000, was the first major milestone. Here, he made a difficult decision to reinvade the region using overwhelming force, regardless of the human and international costs. The logic was clear. Allowing Chechnya to secede would open the door to Russia's complete disintegration. A brutal, swift strike was, in his view, the lesser evil compared to the slow death of the nation. The Russo-Georgian War in 2008 was another turning point. When the Georgian president attacked South Ossetia, Putin was at the Beijing Olympics. His decision was immediate, a swift and decisive military response. The lesson he wanted to convey was clear. Russia had returned as a great regional power and would not allow NATO expansion in its backyard. However, the Ukraine crisis, 2014-present, has been the hardest test. The annexation of Crimea was a historical gamble. Putin risked Russia's international isolation and economic devastation. But his calculation was that the potential losses were less than the strategic gains. Crimea was not just a peninsula, it was a symbol of Russian identity and imperial history. Reclaiming it granted Putin a historical legitimacy surpassing any democratic mandate. In all these crises, a constant pattern emerged: swift and decisive response, the use of military force as a first option, and a willingness to bear international consequences. Putin was not seeking peace at any price, but strategic victory, even at a high cost. This combat doctrine became a political doctrine. In a world that respects power, hesitation is defeat. Assessing Putin's legacy is like looking at a coin with two contradictory sides. On one hand, he's the man who saved Russia from disintegration and restored it as a great power. On the other, he's the leader who turned a nascent democracy into a modern dictatorship and made his country a pariah in much of the world. Domestically, his legacy is the great Russian paradox: stability at the expense of freedom, unity at the expense of diversity, strength at the expense of openness. He built a massive centralized state, but one that is fragile due to its dependence on his person. He achieved economic growth, but it is tied to oil and gas prices. He united the nation around a strong Russian identity, but at the cost of shrinking the space for cultural pluralism. Internationally, Putin changed the rules of the geopolitical game. For centuries, Western powers dominated the international system. Putin came to declare that era over. The Putin doctrine rests on several principles. First, that great powers have spheres of influence, and NATO has no right to expand into Russia's backyard. Second, that sovereignty means the right to interfere in the internal affairs of other states if your vital interests are threatened. Third, that international legalism is an ideological cover for Western power interests. His deepest impact may have been in dismantling the liberal international order. By supporting nationalists and populists in the West and employing hybrid warfare, election interference, media campaigns, proxy armies, he succeeded in proving that Western democracies are not as impregnable as they seem. He shifted the world from a unipolar system to a chaotic, multipolar world, where raw material power alone rules. However, the great question looming over his legacy is, what comes after Putin? He built a system so dependent on his person that many wonder if it can survive without him. The Russia he created is a strong but isolated state, organized but inflexible, cohesive but repressed. Regardless of the final judgment on him, Putin remains one of the pivotal figures of the early 21st century. The man who started in a kommunalka and destroyed Leningrad ended up as a history maker, determining his nation's fate and shaping the world order in ways that will endure for decades to come. Ultimately, his legacy will be a lesson in how a will of steel can make history, but also in how that same will can create complex destinies for nations and the world.
So, what is the ultimate legacy of Vladimir Putin? It is a paradox written on a global scale. He resurrected a collapsed state, but shackled it within a rigid, personality-driven system. He restored national pride, but at the cost of freedom and international isolation. He demanded respect through raw power, proving that a determined will can indeed bend history. He shattered the myth of a unipolar world, forcing a new, more dangerous era of multipolar competition. Putin's story demonstrates that the lessons of a tough childhood, distrust, discipline, and the primacy of strength can be scaled to govern a nuclear power. But it also serves as a stark warning. A system built for one man's survival may not ensure a nation's lasting future. The final chapter of his impact is still being written, not in Moscow, but in the unfolding response of the world he sought to permanently redefine.